Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And we always talk about sustainability issues as well. Now, I've talked about air quality. I've talked about so many things in terms of the aspects of the building that can impact our health, daylighting, of course, thermal comfort, et cetera, but I've never talked about water quality. Today, that changes. I want to introduce you to Cydian Kauffman. Cydian, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Yes, thanks for having me on, Joe. I appreciate it.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and I'm glad we finally get to talk about this topic. Let's learn a little bit about you first. I always do that. Tell us about your background, and tell us about the path that led you to founding of Pure Water Northwest.
Yeah, sure. So I actually have a background in property, strangely. I did property management for 20 years. I was in real estate, house flips. I've managed 400 doors before. I kind of went into mediation as an offshoot of property management because there's so much conflict potentially in property management. I wanted to be one of those guys who was resolving conflict. So I had a mediation practice. I've got a very eclectic background, a lot of sales. But then about 7 years ago, a tenant came to me and they had brown water that smelled like rotten eggs. And I took it to a lab, and the lab came back with the results a few days later, and they said, this water's healthy. That I'll never forget it. That's what the lab technician said. This water's healthy. Brown water that smells like rotten eggs. And I was like, this water is not healthy. And then she corrected herself. She said, this water's within the legal limit. And I was like, is that the same thing? She said, not exactly. And so I had to get clarity on what was wrong with the water. It was just some iron and hydrogen sulfide, which ironically is not that unhealthy. It's not healthy, but it's not that bad for you on the grand scheme of things. But it looks horrible. It smells horrible. It's awful to live with. So I had to tap into my mediation background in order to be able to convince the owner to fix it, given that it was within the legal level. But also, during that process, I was able to reach out to Chris Pelton. The owner of the company that I was working with right then was looking to buy into a water treatment company. So Chris Pelton actually founded Pure Water Northwest. He founded like 15 years ago. And he explained to me all about how there is a difference between the legal level in water set by the EPA and the health level. And the health level is defined as the level below which there is no known health risk. And the legal level is defined as the level that is set as close to the health level as is feasible, taking costs and other factors into consideration. In Canada, they've got similar types of things. In fact, most municipalities have similar things because taking out everything from water is basically impossible. And taking out even most of the stuff you would want out of your water on a large scale is a logarithmic problem. So if they've already got a treatment plant that takes up a football field of real estate, if they need to get the water from 10 parts per million to 1 part per million, they would need 10 football field sizes to do that. Do you see? It becomes an infrastructure and real estate problem. It's unrealistic at that scale. So what it means is people need to treat the water in their home to get down to those levels, which is why we're kind of living in this bubble from the EPA, in our country at least, in a bubble of the fact that they're setting the legal levels with the infrastructure limitations in mind. And that means to get it down lower, you have to treat it in your home, which is why treatment companies exist. And On municipal, on well, you can have anything. So treatment companies exist to help people with their well water because you can have literally anything in well water.
I have a dug well. I live in the country and we have a dug well. And when we first bought the house about 5 years ago, we had the smell of sulfur. And I did a little bit of research and ultimately I ended up putting both a water softener and changing the anode on my hot water tank,
Oh
interestingly
yeah,
enough. Yeah, so I changed from copper to an aluminum anode on my hot water tank, and that combination made the smell go away
yeah,
completely. But I had the same experience where I took the water in for testing and I was within limits on everything. But
yeah.
when you turned on the hot water, like, the mercaptan smell, that's the specific family of chemicals that gives you that rotten egg smell. The
Yeah.
mercaptan smell was very substantial. Like, it was like, how could this possibly pass? So I could totally relate to that experience. And, it's funny, Cydian, the next question that I have on the list here was, do we have a problem with clean water in North America and what's the cause? And you basically just spoke to it, right? I mean, the ability to get to the levels where we really want to get to upstream,
Yeah.
at the government infrastructure end, it starts to get prohibitive. It really does. I mean, unless we change technologies or something, it starts to get
Right.
very cost prohibitive. Is this an issue across, certainly I'll ask across America, is that an issue?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's an issue across the planet. There's some areas that it's a little easier, some areas that it's harder. The Americas have a problem of size. A lot of people don't understand how big the Americas are. Like if you're in another country,
Yeah.
when you're eating eggs that were probably within 10 miles, 20 miles of you, usually. In the United States, at least, you can be eating eggs that were shipped for a week across the country. Like that can happen.
Yeah.
So it is a scope problem that is so difficult to even imagine in some cases. And it creates an infrastructure issue that is just mind boggling. And it's solved obviously by having everything be pocketed into cells. People handle their own area. But that, of course, means that you've got guidelines at the top, and then the way people implement those guidelines are very diverse. So, and then you have the life cycle of contamination as well and of water, the hydrologic cycle, which means as the water is like coming down in rain, and rain is not completely pure by itself. The water's coming down in rain, landing on the mountains, traveling across fields. It's picking up whatever it's traveling across because water's a solvent. So then it drops into wells, drops down into aquifers where you get your water from at your house. And that water has only been filtered through the earth, which means it is losing some contaminants that it got from this top, the soil, but not all of it. And it's gaining some contaminants as it goes down. In well water, and this is where we get into the third fork of the four-part problem. In well water, you can literally have anything in your water, but people are not really educated as to the possibilities of what can be in water. The list of things that can be in water is the entire periodic table of elements, plus every chemical we've ever created from that periodic table. Now, it's not common to have some of those rarer elements, obviously, and there are some things that are perfectly filtered through bedrock, but not everything. So well water tends to have more of one type list of things, and city water has another list of things. But metals are on both lists. So people being educated as to the variety of things that can be in water is another part of the problem, because then nothing's really done about it. Water is a very common problem to avoid because water is ubiquitous, because about half of us is water. People say 90%, but that's false. About half of our bodies are water. Between 40 to 70% of our bodies are water, depending on age and body type and other factors. And because so much of our body is water, and because so much of our life is drinking water, the idea to stop our life and turn and look at the water we've been drinking the whole time, it rarely, if ever, happens. And that's because it's hard to confront. So we have a problem with just the willingness to look at water and then the education about it. And then the fourth problem that leads to the stuff that's in the water, the first being the fact that literally anything can be in the water, the second being infrastructure, the third being education. The fourth problem is just that treatment is kind of a mystical, it still lives in a kind of a mystical, magical thinking realm right now. We've got about every possible suggestion out there for fixing water, from singing to water, playing music at water, throwing light of a certain type into water. And then we have the semi-sciences, which is structuring water, which has some scientific backing, but not to the point where it is relevant to drinking water. And
Structuring water? I'm not sure I understand. Could you
yeah,
explain to us what that means?
yeah, sure. I mean, structuring water is essentially putting water against a hydrophilic surface so that it lays against the surface in a way that makes the water molecules bond evenly, essentially, like in a structure. And a scientist went through all the work to determine that, yes, if we drank structured water, we would be healthier. But the instant you pour water into your mouth, it loses structure, obviously. So it's a purely hypothetical thing
Right.
that the scientists did the work to figure out. And people are spending money to structure their water so that they can then drink this with the thought that this is healthier. You
Okay.
understand?
Yeah, I got you now. Okay. Go
Yes.
ahead.
And as soon as you tip it into your mouth, it loses its structure, obviously. There's some evidence that fruit retains its structure into your stomach. And that actually makes some sense because it's bound internally in the cell walls of the fruit. But again, we're talking like tiny nano relations to actual health benefits. It's virtually non existent. There's misunderstandings about alkalinity and the benefits that has. Your stomach acid is so strong, any alkalinity in the water is gone like that when you drink it. Hydrogen water has some actual benefits, not a ton, but it has some provable benefits. And then there's getting stuff out of the water and getting water pure. And there's many different ways people do that. And then there's this tiny section of all of this mess that is hard water science. And that's the type of stuff we try and do, the stuff that the WQA, the Water Quality Association of America, pushes for. I'm sure there's similar things in Canada. And that hard water science is where we try and meet customers to help them ameliorate the remaining problem that's left by the municipalities or left when their well water happens to not be good water.
Right. Someday, Cydian, when you're bored, which I'm sure happens all the time, someday when you're bored, look up the Walkerton, Ontario incident that occurred in Canada about 25 years ago. Multiple deaths. So basically, it was a fecal coliform contamination
Oh,
that made its way through. The testing that was supposed to have been done wasn't done, and massive human error, mistakes, but it was quite the story. So water quality is on the mind of many. Well, if you're over about the age of 40 in Canada, you're probably acutely aware of the issues associated with water quality.
is that the one where they decided to stop chlorinating?
I can't remember the root cause of it, but ultimately, it was a Friday afternoon when they got the bad sample and decided it could wait till Monday. And essentially that was how it went down. And by the time Monday rolled around, there had been multiple deaths. And yeah, it was a very bad scene. So it's certainly something that's on our minds at all.
Forget the old paradigm that privacy means darkness. With Solera translucent glazings, architects can design spaces that are private, filled with natural light, and visually stunning. It's time to rethink how buildings work and feel. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
I want to change topics just a tiny little bit. We're still talking about water for sure, but I want to move away from homes a little bit. And let's talk about some of the institutional buildings, Cydian, because I'm sure you do some work there, right?
Sure.
What do you know about what happens with water quality in schools and hospitals? Are there different standards for schools and hospitals? Do they face different challenges?
Yeah. The standards for schools are the same. The standards for hospitals are depending on the usage.
Okay.
We do work with a lot of these situations. We've helped with situations like what you talked about with that outbreak before, where people have underchlorinated and have gotten E. coli. We're helping in hospitals where they need to have super clean water for autoclaves to clean their instruments. So it is definitely usage based. Schools are a little bit of a interesting problem because schools are usually large buildings, and due to budget concerns, if they're not brand new schools, they're usually in old schools, old buildings.
Right.
And that has an infrastructure problem of lead pipes. In Washington State, in fact, March of this year, a school in Washington found that 8 out of the 21 drinking water outlets had too much lead in them. Like just this year.
Wow.
In the school, you have to shut that fountain off. Now they have less fountains to drink from. And my problem with that is, like, I happen to know how lead testing is done, and I'm hoping they did it right. But it is also possible for that to fluctuate somewhat. And so I would be worried about the remaining drinking water fountains or any amount of lead being in them. I'm not sure why they're not doing reverse osmosis systems in those situations, because they should be. They had something, I can't remember, but they had something like 15% or 20% of all the samples tested, the 33,000 samples tested since 2018, like 15% or something have come back with lead over the level.
Wow.
Edmond School District, I remember, had a huge amount. There were some that were like 20 times the legal level, and that means it's way over the health level. So, yeah, there's a problem. And lead is one of the largest infrastructure problems in the United States because so much of our old plumbing is lead. And all that plumbing's buried under concrete and sometimes homes and so many things. There's new tricky technology to help remediate all that, but it's definitely an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very consequential issue. I want to change over to a new contaminant, if you don't mind. Or sorry, a contaminant that's newly in the spotlight. Okay. And that is microplastics. How often does that come up in your world these days?
I mean, a lot. So it's not in municipal water or well water as much as people fear.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah, it's in pretty much every single bottle of water you drink. So remember, we were talking earlier about the size of the United States, and Canada obviously is, I think it's bigger.
Significantly. Yeah.
Yes, it's bigger, right? So the size of these countries is just so vast. You're transporting product just for a really long time.
Yeah.
So if you bottle water at a facility, you're getting microplastics off that plastic immediately, but not very much. But as it sits and it like shakes and it changes temperature, the thermal expansion of the plastic and shrinking, that is releasing tons of microplastics into bottled water. Bottled water is already, in the US at least, I don't know about Canada, but in the US it is one of the least regulated industries. Much bottled water is literally tap water, and they just run it through a chlorine filter. Some of the better ones run them through reverse osmosis. But even after that, once they're put in the bottle, it's going to be leaching plastics and chemicals off of those bottles. So you will get microplastics in the water. There is some microplastics in some municipalities too. And then that is not as big a problem as in the bottled water, though. I think the NIH did a study and found 20,000 particles of microplastics per bottle of water on average.
Okay.
20,000 particles, which is a huge problem.
Where does that fall in terms of like parts per million or parts per billion in the water?
Well, so I have to sit down and type out the math on that. But in fact, I could probably do that. That was 20,000 particles per liter. And these are microplastics, so we're down to the micron range.
Right.
They're not nanoplastics. I'm sure there are also nanoplastics. I don't think they tested for that. So I'd have to do the math on it, but it's more than you want.
Right.
I mean,
And that's what matters. Yeah, that's the part that matters. Yeah,
someone,
it's interesting. What I hear about is microplastics from the perspective of deterioration. So somebody throws out that bottle, it finds its way into a forest, and the bottle degenerates over time, and then the polymer starts breaking down, and there's no certainty as to what it's exactly going to break down to every single time. So you end up with these very small partial polymers or monomers or even cleaved monomers, and you can get some pretty bizarre stuff. And it's just starting to come to light now that this mechanism is finding its way into our drinking water. So, like I say, very much an emerging sort of concern, but definitely a concern. I was just curious if that's come up yet in your day to day. But let's talk about something that I just about guarantee you comes up in your day to day, and that's the PFASs. Can you tell us a little bit about what they are and how you guys deal with them?
Yeah. So they're called forever chemicals, and they're basically called that because they're really rugged chemicals. They don't go away.
Right.
They're going to outlive many bodies on this planet. The strange thing about PFAS is there's potentially hundreds of thousands of them. There's 30, I think, I may be not perfectly accurate on this, but I think there's about 30,000 that we are highly suspecting. There's 6 total that we've fully identified. That right there is just, obviously people in the audience are probably, that's insane. Why would that be? The reason for that is because we're talking about parts per trillion here.
Right.
And parts per trillion is a hard number to imagine. Parts per million is like a single sugar cube in a bathtub of water, or like 1 second in 11 days. Parts per billion is like a sugar cube in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or 1 second in 30 years. And parts per trillion is like a sugar cube in an ocean, or a small ocean, or a giant lake, or like 1 second in 30,000 years. So parts per trillion are hard to even detect. It takes special equipment to even like do it. So actually, even looking and observing the PFAS forever chemicals, that is nearly impossible. It's very difficult to do. And we care about the parts per trillion. The EPA, I don't know what's happened in Canada, but I think they're on a similar track. The EPA just last year made the legal level for forever chemicals be in the parts per trillion, which means the amount has to be way lower than it is. Like in some cases, like 5,000, 10,000 times lower than it is right now. And the EPA, unfortunately, doesn't have to implement that till 2031 under this current administration. So we have a genuine problem with PFAS. And the effects that it can have, I mean, where it comes from is, before I talk about the effects, PFAS was an invented man-made chemical. It comes from things like fire foams, which are, things you don't necessarily want to not use because it's a good way to put out a fire that water can't. And it comes from Teflon and other water-resistant things. And so that gets into the water. It gets into animals that you eat. It gets into the water you drink. Then it gets into your body. And the exposure has been linked to so many strange things. Basically, the entire list of things has been somewhat linked. Kidney cancer, thyroid disease, liver damage, hair loss. Like there's this strange suspicion that some people are losing their hair because of bathing in it that I've run into. So it's an interesting problem. It's a real, genuine, probably, in my opinion, one of the largest problems we have in this country right now.
What can we do? What actions can be taken to minimize their impact?
Well, this is a nicer answer today than it was a few years ago. Even just a few years ago, if you asked me that question, the whole industry was kind of scratching their head and going, Well, we know carbon helps. We know anion resin helps, but we don't know how much. Now we know it actually helps quite a bit. Carbon media that is a high-grade catalytic carbon can help it quite a bit. And this is purely because it's capturing it at a very small level. So carbon is kind of a magical filter. A single gram of carbon, so like this much carbon, has so many tiny porous tunnels inside of it. If you were to take all that surface area inside that little gram and spread it out, it would cover 3 tennis courts. And so as the water is traveling through this carbon, it's getting inside all those holes. And then the stuff those holes are so small that the particles that are in the water, like PFAS, can actually leave the water and bind to the side of the carbon. That's called adsorption. And it can do a good job of pulling it out. Carbon doesn't solve everything, and it is not the very best way to resolve, but it is the best way to resolve PFAS that is inexpensive and can be implemented on a wide array of applications. A slightly better way of doing it is specific types of anion resins that like draw in a certain negative charge, like pull in negatively charged ions. And the problem with that is you have to clean those, and sometimes they have to be thrown away. Carbon can be a similar thing, but it cleans a little easier and can be revived a little easier in some cases. So we have some decent solutions. Under-counter reverse osmosis, though, is a very good way to go. It's the most reliable, like, catch-all for ameliorating most things in water and for certainly ameliorating or remediating PFAS. So, yeah, that's a good magic bullet in a manner of speaking. But that's point of use.
So how do people even find out that they have an issue with PFAS? Because I don't remember it being on any of the test charts, or I don't ever remember seeing a report that listed it. How do they, like, is it just somebody has to be in the know, or a company has to come along and say, have you checked for PFAS? How do we find out?
2 years ago, 3 years ago, nobody knew. And you were having to do like $2,000-$3,000 tests on your own water, very expensive tests
Yeah.
on your own water. And that's the only way you ever knew. Now people are testing it. Like the EPA makes that rule, now people are testing it.
Okay.
Recently, they did a test on, I think, 20-something different river sources, and 80%, something like 80% of them had PFAS in the river sources. Municipalities are now testing for it, and they're like, oh, we have PFAS. Oh, we have PFAS. Oh, we have PFAS, like over and over again. The Environmental Working Group, they have a tap water database. You can search it yourself. You go to EWG tap water in Google and it'll come up. Then there's a little pop-up that comes up that you can fill out or skip. You can skip it. And then you type in your zip code and it'll pull it up, your water, if you're on a municipal source. And they will have, very recently, they have started doing PFAS testing with their test samples they get in. And that has been showing some surprising numbers too. So not everywhere has it. It's not like you are 100% guaranteed to have it, but it is in a lot of places right now.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. All right, I want to talk about building types before we go, Cydian. This one's kind of a big one for me, and maybe the answer is just no, but are there any sort of consequential differences both in water quality and treatment from, say, industrial, commercial, institutional buildings compared to homes? We sort of talked about this before, but I want to be very explicit about it. Residences compared to, these sort of commercial buildings. What are the big differences in terms of water quality and treatment that is necessary?
Sure. So when it comes to commercial buildings, the problems you generally run into, so buildings cost money to build, and the size of them determines that. So there is a tendency towards larger buildings being older because of that, if that makes sense. It's not always the case, but every building's going to have an age. The age of a building will give you some relationship, some identity of being able to tell, okay, is there lead in this water?
Right.
Or could there be lead? Is this something you need to test for more often? And so what you do need to think about is that whether or not lead is coming off of a pipe is also related to the corrosivity of the water. So a thing called the Langular Saturation Index. Another index is the sulfite to chloride mass ratio, and the pH of the water. So those three factors describe how acidic the water is, how hungry the water is to pull contaminants off of it, or how much it's going to weaken the pipe and cause it to leach. So the way to ameliorate that is full repipes, which is incredibly expensive.
Yep.
But it is the best way to do it, obviously. Then there's stuff that you can do to buy yourself time. You can change the pH and the corrosivity of the water to some degree with the treatment system. That will buy you time. And then you can give yourself a point of use drinking water system, so at least you're not drinking that water. And so when you're thinking about residential versus commercial, at home, you care about that a lot. You're going to do those tests. But if you're in a building, I mean, that has a whole bureaucratic infrastructure behind it that's going to determine how carefully they're monitoring that. And it isn't always monitored on a range or a level that you want. It is not always checked the way you would want. So it becomes a real consideration in some cases that people should be thinking about.
So one of the hottest sort of topics in healthy buildings these days, or what's the term they use? Building related, I can't remember what the I stands for, BRIs. So basically building related diseases is, one of the big issues is continuous monitoring of the air quality, right? Checking for CO2 levels, any sort of particulate contaminant, which is also easy to test live. Is there an equivalent in water where we can continuously monitor for some key components?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so it becomes this. So first of all, air has a significantly better dispersion rate than water does. So when you're monitoring air, if something's happening across the room and your monitor's on the other side of the room, it's not going to take long. I mean, obviously flow matters, but it's not going to take long for that to get over here and for that, right?
Right.
Unlike that, if I have a sensor in one part of our system, or even on the incoming part, it does not necessarily mean it's going to be the same as the water in one fixture. And things like biofilm, things like pipe type, things like buildup on the inside of the plumbing, things like the height of the building, meaning the amount of pressure pushing up versus the amount of pressure pushing down on the whole system, the 9-story building, for example. All of those factors will change to some degree what the output water is. How much water sits in plumbing. Yeah.
Is there any continuous monitoring to look for, a buildup of biofilm or, no?
Biofilm is incredibly difficult to monitor anyhow.
Right.
In order to identify biofilm, it's many different types of tests. One way to capture it in a probabilistic sense is doing what's called a heterotrophic plate count test. But even that is not perfect and requires a lab. You can't just monitor it. The only monitoring we have is things like TDS monitoring or pH monitoring on the fly. And that kind of total dissolved solids is literally just monitoring the electrical conductivity of the water.
Right.
Because water that's perfectly clean can be put on a motherboard. I mean, if you had perfect water, you could douse your computer in it and it would run just fine.
Yep.
Maybe better because it wouldn't heat up, but it would not transfer electricity. The reason water is conductive is because of the metals in it and the various other dissolved solids in it. And so measuring dissolved solids is a very generalistic way to identify what's in the water, but it doesn't capture everything, and it's not perfect, and it's going to change based on where you're testing it. So no, monitoring is not, unfortunately, we're not there yet for monitoring water.
Gotcha.
One way to help with that, though, is if you really are like, look, I want this building to be amazing. I have a customer right now who's very near us, and they're like, I want this water. They're doing a full remodel on their building. They're taking over a whole building, and they're just making it their building. And they're like, I want every drinking water to be perfect. So they're going to plumb in line to all these different drinking water fountains. And for that, they're just going to put in reverse osmosis, a very large reverse osmosis system that's going to run through PEX plumbing to these various faucets. And then they're in control of what their water output is that way. So treatment is a way to control that. Monitoring is very weak right now.
Gotcha. Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Okay, we're getting close to the end, Cydian. So there's a question that I ask every guest. Same question for every guest. And I ask that you answer it from whatever perspective you like. And this is not exactly your bailiwick, but like I say, answer however you'd like. What makes a great building?
I think a great building is a building that looks ahead to its use, considers the people that will live there, and then reverse engineers their needs into the building. And that's obviously going to consider every factor. Light is going to be one of the biggest factor. Available usage of the resources of the building, the showers, plumbing, the electrical outlets, and then water, obviously, and making sure that the water is as clean as it can be. So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Fantastic. All right. Before we go, do you have any exciting announcements or anything that you'd like to promote, Cydian?
Well, I mean, Pure Water Northwest is a very consultative company. So we are innovating on the fly all the time. We basically look at the water, identify what's in it, and treat based on that. So we don't usually have exciting announcements. Ironically, though, we had so many customers recently come to us with Kangen products, and those are incredibly expensive. And I looked into it, and doing what Kangen does, I can do for much, much less money. So we are very close to being able to essentially duplicate the same thing that people get from Kangen, the same hydrogenated water, even more pure though, and we can do it for much less money, about half the price. So
wow,
that's kind of an innovation that we've very recently started on and are probably 2 or 3 months from concluding. So if anyone wants that, we're here for you.
very substantial. Tell us what your website is.
Oh, it's purewaternorthwest.com. It's a very long website. It's all, spell out every word, purewaternorthwest.com.
Perfect. Cydian, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I'm so glad I finally did this.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.